Peace. So I just wanted to take a moment and build a little bit about power, which represents the number five. The number five is a composite or composed of one and four, the same way that power is a composite or is composed of knowledge and culture. It's also composed of wisdom and understanding, which is two and three. So when you're thinking about power, one of the things we oftentimes say as a 5% is power represents the truth. And the truth about power is that it is a force. It represents strength, might, as well as influence. And when you're looking at it within the context of culture, right? One of the most influential or powerful or dominant aspects of culture is knowing social norms. So, in other words, when you're looking at power being the number five and knowledge culture being a composite or parts of power, when you are doing the knowledge or learning or being aware of culture or people activities, various different things that people say and do, a person's way of life, one of the most powerful aspects of a person's way of life or a people's way of life are social norms. Now, what are social norms? Social norms are acceptable standards of behavior. And a lot of times those acceptable standards of behavior are not communicated. They're unspoken. So for example, here in this country of America, a social norm or an acceptable standard of behavior is when you get into an elevator, you have your back against the wall facing the open doors. And that is a common social norm here in this country. Now, something that would be considered abnormal or outside of a social norm is if you got into an elevator with a bunch of people that you don't even know, and instead of having your back towards the wall looking at the open doors, you turn around with your back towards the open doors and stand there and stare at everybody the whole time you in the elevator. It's awkward and it's abnormal. It's outside of social norms. Now, usually people don't have a discussion and say, when you get into an elevator, you stand with your back against the wall and you look forward at the open doors. People usually don't discuss things like that, but when you look at acceptable standards of behavior, these are things that are usually non-verbally communicated. And the reason I say that it's power in recognizing social norms is because those acceptable standards of behavior is where you really find the so-called principles and values of a culture. What people see as important, what people recognize as the way in which you should function or operate. And a lot of times when we look at culture or a person's way of life, we don't really consider that social norms or what are considered acceptable standards of behavior are the underlining significant things that hold all of these people activities together. And that is where you really find the truth of how a person lives, when you just simply observe them. So knowledge, we also oftentimes say, is a look, listen, observe, and respect. That is a scientific approach. And if you really want to get a good sense of a person's way of life or a people's way of life, you have to be able to recognize what those social norms are. And a lot of times those social norms are not communicated explicitly. These things are non-verbally communicated. And these social norms are things that you oftentimes may not read in a textbook. You may not see in a video. You may not see in a documentary or anything like that. You really have to be around people who live a certain way of life in order to recognize some of these so-called acceptable standards of behavior. Now, you may live in a city or a municipality that has a suburban section. It may have a rural section. It may have an urban section. Those various different sections of that municipality may have various different social norms. There's things that are acceptable standards of behavior in a suburban environment that may not be acceptable in a rural environment, that may not be acceptable in an urban environment. And these are things that you have to learn on your own through look, listen, observing, and respecting what you actually are around and amongst. And a lot of times people miss the point or don't ascertain certain aspects of power or influence because they're not investing enough time in striving to investigate what are the social norms, what are the acceptable standards of behavior of people who live in this place. And as an educator, that is one of the challenges that we've had thus far just in this school year coming out of this pandemic, because we've had a lot of students that, in terms of their social norms, that has entirely changed, where now they are being integrated back into an academic environment and being accustomed to the norms or the acceptable standards of behavior that represent this academic environment. And these are things that we're always learning and always growing. So I will, this was inspiring, it was empowering, it was educational. It just gave those of you some insight into power or influence, and how one of the most influential aspects of culture is doing the knowledge or learning about or being aware of social norms, because those social norms represents the underlying significance of the principles and values that connects all of those people activities that we define as culture. Peace.